Shalom, everybody. So, most recently, an Ashkenazi Jew, who is the president of Israel, came out and said that they are the descendants of King David. He claimed that he and his family are direct descendants of King Solomon, and he says rabbis have carefully recorded his family tree as proof of his biblical bloodline. Now, we know that this is all lies because the true descendants of King David were not Ashkenazi Jews, nor were they in Eastern Europe. And I know this to be fact because it is documented where they were all the way up until the Middle Ages and even afterwards. During the Middle Ages, the descendants of King David were either in Babylon, which is modern day Iraq, or they were in Spain. Now, with the Spanish Inquisition, we know that they got kicked out of Spain. But they did not go to Eastern Europe. They were not in Russia. They were not in Poland or Ukraine. They did not migrate there. And I'll get into where they ended up. But we know for certain that the descendants of King David were not Ashkenazi. They had no relation to these people claiming to be their heirs. Okay, so we'll start with the descendants of King David that were in Babylon because they came first, and the ones that lived in Spain would become their counterparts. The Babylonian captivity or exile was a foundational biblical period where Jews from the kingdom of Judah were deported to Babylon following the destruction of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Driven by idolatry and rebellion, it began as divine judgment but led to a spiritual rebirth of Judaism. According to the Bible, the exile unfolded in three primary waves as recounted in the second book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles. In 605 BC, following Babylon's victory over Egypt, the first wave of deportations took place, including noble youths like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In 597 BC, after King Joachim of Judah rebelled, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, deposing King Jehoiakim and took thousands of Judean elites, craftsmen, and warriors captive. In 586 BC, after a final revolt by King Zedekiah, the Babylonians breached Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and carried the majority of the remaining population into exile. It wouldn't be until after 70 years that a remnant of these Jews would return back to Jerusalem. And this also would occur in three waves. The first occurring in 538 through 536 BC. This first return was led by Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, where an estimated 42,360 exiles came back to Jerusalem and laid the foundations to rebuild the second temple, which was finished around 516 BC. The second return was 457 through 458 BC, led by the scribe and priest Ezra. A smaller group returned to restore religious law and community standards in Jerusalem, followed up by the third return in 444 BC, led by Nehemiah, who arrived as governor to rebuild the broken and ruined defensive walls around Jerusalem. So although some Jews returned back to Jerusalem, a lot still remained behind in Babylon. And due to this, there was an historical authority struggle between both Jerusalem and the Jews of Babylon. Now, ultimately, the Jews in Babylon will prevail over those in Jerusalem because we know in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Now, Jerusalem held original sanctity, of course, and primacy because ultimately the temple was there. But when it was destroyed, everything shifted over to Babylon. Jerusalem and the academies of the Galilee held the original historic and legislative authority, producing the Mishnah and the Jerusalem Talmud around the 4th and 5th century CE. Due to the political stability of the Sasanian Empire, Babylonian academies flourished under the leadership of Raish Galusa, who was an exilarch of King David, and prominent sages finalized the Babylonian Talmud around 500 CE. In cases of legal contradiction between the two traditions, Jews universally came to follow the Babylonian Talmud and authority because it was later in time and it represented a more thoroughly edited consensus. And for those who are unaware of what the Talmud is, it is basically the foundational compilation of the Jews' oral law, serving as the central text of Rabbinic Judaism and second in authority only to the Hebrew Bible. It is a massive multi-volume record of centuries of rabbinic debates, ethical teachings, philosophy, and legal rulings. Now, as for me, I have my own opinion on the Talmud. It is more based on the traditions of men, as the Messiah is recorded as in the Hebrew scriptures of the New Testament. I share the same opinion that he had during his time because it all traces back to that time period. Once again, it's the central text of Rabbinic Judaism. During that time, it was the rabbis in Jerusalem that were interpreting the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew laws, the laws of Moses, that is the Torah, and they would give their own interpretation of what those things meant and how they should be practiced and so on and so on. But we knew during the time of Yeshua that many of these rabbis were hypocrites. And many Jews despised them over that. So not every Jew believed in the Talmud. In fact, it wasn't around during the time of Yeshua the Messiah's life here on earth. It is something that was fairly new. Remember, it came 420 years after the fall of Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. So this was a new religious text, and it was influenced by the Mishnah, which came around in 200 CE by Rabbi Judah the Prince. And once again, it all dates back to the oral traditions and legal debates among the ancient sages and rabbis that came out of Jerusalem. So before the Talmud and the Mishnah came around, you simply had oral law. This was just rabbis giving their own interpretations of the Torah, the written law of Moses, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These rabbis' interpretation of the Torah became known as the tradition of the elders. These unwritten rules is what would influence the book of the Mishnah and the Talmud. It was the Pharisees that generated the core legal opinions, debates, and material that later generations compiled into the written Mishnah. And this took place after the Roman destruction of the second temple. The Pharisee movement transitioned into what history calls Rabbinic Judaism. And later rabbis preserved the oral traditions in writing to prevent them from being forgotten, resulting in the text known today as the Mishnah and ultimately the Talmud. So the Pharisees is why we have the Talmud today and why it became a part of the history for Jews. But not all Jews subscribe to that. But it's a part of the history, and it's also why the center of influence shifted to Babylon because the Babylon adopted the Talmud and it was more up to date than the Talmud in Jerusalem due to the destruction of the temple. So by the early medieval period under the Judean, which is the Talmudic Jews of Babylon, they became the centralized authority that was accepted by diaspora communities from Spain to North Africa as the definitive arbiter of the Jews' practices. So that's one of the reasons why Babylon became the main center of influence for Jews. The other, of course, is the Exilarchs were always in Babylon. The royal lineage that was believed to descend directly from King David through Jeconiah, they were always in Babylon. They never returned back to Jerusalem because they was forbidden to do so, of course, by Persian kings and the Muslim rulers that would succeed them in the following centuries. Though they were unable to return to their homeland as kings, they still were respected as such in the foreign lands that they were in. They acted as an ethnarch or king-like figure recognized by Persian and Islamic governments. They collected taxes, managed community infrastructure, and oversaw legal enforcement. And power was shared and sometimes contested between these secular exilarch kings and the rabbinic authorities known as Judeanism, which is once again the Talmudic rabbis. And these Talmudic rabbis ran the academies and religious courts, while the exilarch held executive and political authority as being the royal bloodline and lineage of King David. During the Middle Ages, the Exilarchs experienced a golden era of wealth and prestige under early Islamic rule, followed by a severe institutional decline and an eventual dissolution by Mongol invaders. As the hereditary princes of the captivity, claiming direct lineage to King David, they held immense authority. Their history across the medieval era unfolded in several distinct phases. From 750 to 950 CE, they were under the Abbasid Caliphate. The establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate shifted the center of the Islamic world to Baghdad, elevating the Babylonian Jewish community to unparalleled prominence. Abbasid caliphs officially recognized the Exilarch Ras el-Julat as a noble court official and the political head of all Jews in the empire. The Exilarchs collected taxes, appointed judges, and owned vast estates, markets, and plantations across the Mesopotamia. Contemporary accounts, like those from traveler Benjamin of Tudela, forgive me if I mispronounced that, describe the Exilarch riding in royal apparel with a large retinue, commanding respect from Jews and Muslims alike. But during 950 CE through 1250 CE, this golden age of the Exilarchs began to decline due to bitter internal rivalries. So the mid to late Middle Ages brought structural decay caused primarily by vicious power struggles within the Jews' leadership. The Exilarchs frequently clashed with the Judeanim, which were the Talmudic Jews and the intellectual heads of prestigious Babylonian rabbinic academies of Sora and Pumbedita. A historic feud between Exilarch David ben Zakkai and Zediah Gaon shattered communal unity. As the authority of the central office fractured around 10,000 CE, Jewish communities in Spain, North Africa, and Europe became self-sufficient cutting off the revenue and tithes that previously flowed to Baghdad. By 1040 CE, following the deposition of Exilarch Hezekiah, the office faced major disruptions, with descendants fleeing to safer regions like Spain. During 1258 CE through 1401 CE, the Mongol invasion would bring about the final blow to the Exilarchs of Babylon. The physical destruction of Baghdad fundamentally altered the fate of the institution of the Jews. When Hulagu Khan brutally sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate, he spared the Jews community and the Exilarch Samuel ben David. The Exilarchs temporarily retained their titles under Mongol regional rule. However, the final blow came in 1401. The lineage and formal office of the Babylonian Exilarchs were completely eradicated during the devastating conquest of Tamerlane in 1401. Following the medieval collapse, the title was never restored. Local leadership in Iraq shifted to wealthy merchants and community leaders known as the Nasi or Hakan Bashi, chief rabbi. So the Exilarchs were no longer a main factor in Babylon following 1401. In fact, many of them, if not most, ended up in Spain. They ended up migrating to Spain to escape the persecution and the decline in Babylon. And here is the map of the Timurid Empire. It makes up all of what is Iran today. It took up most of the Persian Empire and it stretched into modern day Iraq. The Jews were located in the area of Iraq. They settled along the southern coast, all of Iran. And interestingly, today, the communities that are known to be in the southern coast of Iran are Afro-Iranians. And this is something that we'll come back to after we found out more about what happened to the Exilarchs in Spain after the collapse in Babylon. Okay, so the Exilarchs and Jews who lived in Spain and Portugal is well documented all throughout the Middle Ages. In fact, there's books written by Jews that documented the long list of history from them being taken into captivity in Babylon up until that point in history in the Iberian Peninsula. And one of the recommendations that I have, if you're somebody that's into learning history, I recommend the book Consolation for the Tribulations of Israel by Samuel Usque. He was an exile from the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal. And this book was written in the 16th century. So this book was written right around the time that the transatlantic slave trade was going on. And Portugal and Spain had already set up colonies in the Americas. So this was when this book was written. And he speaks about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal. He speaks about the Spanish Inquisition, or I should say Catholic Inquisition, and how they forced Jews to convert to Christianity. This wasn't something that Jews wanted to do. This was something that was literally forced upon them. And he writes, although these Jews converted to Christianity under force, many of their problems did not go away. They still experienced the same problems as the rest of the Jews who didn't convert to Christianity. And that's what led him to writing this book, The Consolation for Tribulations of Israel. And he referred to those Jews who converted to Christianity as Nuevo Christians or New Christians. They were also called Marranos. That is the equivalent of a pig. They were hated by Portuguese and Spanish Christians or Europeans. They were despised. They were persecuted. And this persecution came in waves all throughout the medieval ages. They would have times of peace. They would have an era of a golden age. But following that, they would still experience tribulation, the same tribulation that came upon the Jews in Babylon. So in this book, Samuel Usque says that this has a lot to do with the curses written in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28. And he said that these Jews in Spain, would experience the last of these curses because the empires of Spain and Portugal stretched upon the whole world, right? The dominion of the world given to them by the Pope was from the ends of the earth. And he was aware that the prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 28, written by Moses, foretold that the Jews were going to be scattered to the end of the earth and persecuted all throughout the nations that they were in. So he wrote this book basically to give hope to the Jews, his people, that they were nearing the end of their tribulation that has lasted, I guess you could say, all the way from 700 BC up until today, because they still have not been restored. And by restored, I mean the Most High himself has not came to gather them from the ends of the earth to bring them back into the land of Israel. So he wrote this book to basically let the Jews know that that time is near, because Spain and Portugal basically was fulfilling the entire prophecy of them being scattered to the ends of the earth. Now, though Samuel was a Talmudic Jew, I still recommend his book as an historical account. It goes deep into the persecution of the Jews all throughout the Middle Ages. In this painting right here of the King's Fountain in Lisbon, Portugal, from 1570 through 1580, you can see there are black people amongst white Europeans. And one of the people on the horses that you see who is black, he has a red cross on the back of his clothing. This is a Nuevo Christian, a new Christian. They also were called Marranos, or Converso Jews, or Crypto Jews. It was these individuals that Samuel Usque wrote about. With the fall of the Babylon Exilarchs and many migrating to Spain, Spain became the center for the Jews. During the reign of the Moors, which started in 700 AD in the Iberian Peninsula, Muslims tolerated the Jews. They were able to have economic success, and they were able to have a golden age all the way up until 1492. Unlike Christian Europe, Muslim rulers provided these Jews relative safety and freedom. Jews served as diplomats, viziers, and physicians in courts like Cordoba and Granada. Integration with Arabic culture spurred advancements in Hebrew grammar, philosophy, and poetry. So the Jews were flourishing in Spain specifically. As the traditional Babylonian center for Jews declined around 10,000 CE, it shifted westward to the Iberian Peninsula. Figures like the Maimonides, Yehuda Halevi, Hasdai Sheprut, and many others. They produced monumental philosophical and scientific works. Jews worked freely in agriculture, commerce, science, and crafts, making up large influential percentage of the regional population in Spain. Under Christian kingdoms, there was a resemblance of this as well. During the early Reconquista, Christian kings in Toledo and Aragon utilized Jews as administrators, translators, and financiers. Cities like Toledo remained major hubs of Torah scholarship and cultural translation until growing religious persecution and the 1492 Alhambra decree forced their exile. And the Jews that these Christian kings typically entrusted to were the direct descendants of King David. They were the Exilarchs, and interestingly, the main lineage of King David, which became known as the YAH lineage, they were giving a synonym or a nickname that was O Negro, which is translated to English, the Black. This nickname was inherited from Yaish Yaya, who was made lord of the town of Aldea dos Negros, which means village of the Negroes or blacks, near Obidos, Portugal, by King Alfonso I. Members of this Exilarch descended family served as high-ranking courtiers, tax supervisors, and chief rabbis in Portugal and Spain during the Middle Ages. And though these Christian rulers casted this nickname upon the descendants of King David, they would not have referred to themselves as Negroes. The title that would have been acceptable for them was Negid. Negid is a Hebrew word meaning prince, leader, or ruler. It describes a communal leader and high authority in medieval communities of Jews, especially in Spain and Egypt. It is used in the Hebrew Bible, such as for King Saul, to designate a leader or ruler chosen or guided by the Most High. So a common name for a descendant of King David or the Exilarchs would have been Negid, such as the prominent statesman and scholar in Granada known as Samuel Usque. But as these Christian Europeans began their Reconquista, it would be the title or nickname Negro that would be casted upon these Jews and these exilarchs who descended from King David. This would be a sign of who they were. They were called Negroes in Spain and in Portugal. So what happened to these exilarchs in Portugal? Well, following the Spanish Inquisition in 1492 and the subsequent Portuguese expulsions of the Jews, that is, forced converts or secret crypto Jews, they migrated into Portuguese colonial holdings, establishing an early presence in coastal Angola and Luanda. Despite the geographic distance, individuals originating from or living in Angola occasionally surface in Inquisition records in Lisbon or Brazil, such as Mariana Pequena, an Angolan woman tried for practicing Judaism in 1711. In 1711, a woman named Mariana Pequena stood before the Portuguese Inquisition in Lisbon, Portugal, accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Born in Angola and later enslaved and taken to Brazil, she had managed to secure her freedom, but she could not escape her past or her faith. Testimony suggested that she observed the customs of the Jews and was accused of clinging to beliefs and rituals associated with Judaism. For this, she was condemned. So Mariana was a Negro woman brought from Angola to Brazil who was a Jew, and she practiced the customs of a Jew. Just as Samuel Usque stated in his book, the tribulation and persecution of Jews would follow them to the ends of the earth, as it was prophesied by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28. Mariana was just one of many Negroes who would suffer the same fate. However, the Spanish Inquisition, or Catholic Inquisition, had no bearing in the American English colonies that Negroes were being brought to in 1619. The first Negroes recorded in English America has still retained their Portuguese and Spanish names because many of them had come from Ndongo or Angola, which was a Portuguese colony. So these first arrivals that arrived at Jamestown in 1619 had the names Angela, Anthony, and Isabella, and they were captured from Portuguese slave ships, such as the White Lion. And many initially carried Iberian names and retained them in the records. And the English captors and masters quickly assigned common English or biblical first names like William, Mary, or John, as seen with Anthony and Isabella's son, William. So the first Negroes who arrived in English colonies as slaves originally had Portuguese Spanish names. Not only did they have Portuguese and Spanish names, but they also carried a nickname along with them. A nickname that was specifically given to the lineage of King David back in Portugal, and that is Negro. Here's the names of the first Negro slaves that arrived in the English colonies of America. In the 1624-1625 Virginia census, it is documented that the names of the slaves of Captain William Tucker was Anthony Negro and Isabella Negro, and their child, who was baptized, was named William. He was the first recorded black child born in English America. Now, here are the descendants of those first enslaved Negroes that were captured and brought to Virginia. And this was taken most recently, reflecting on America's 250th anniversary. And notice what you see. These are people of color. These are so-called black people. And they have the description that matches up with the Bible itself as it pertains to King David. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 16, verse 12, here's how King David is described by his appearance. It says, "And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look upon. And YAH said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he." So King David was ruddy. And if you don't know what that means, that is a term used to describe a reddish brown type of color. So King David was reddish brown. And look at what you see by those descendants of the Negroes that were first brought to America. Many of whom is documented as being Jews. These people were known to be Jews. Remember, after the Spanish and Portugal expulsions, many of the Exilarchs and descendants of King David, many of the Jews, they went to the coast of Africa. And upon being brought to the New World as servants or slaves, they had became new Christians. They were forced to be baptized as Christians by slave masters. But secretly, some of them retained their heritage and they became known as crypto Jews. So that's why there was Spanish Inquisitions happening in Southern America and places like Brazil. But fortunately, the English colonies, they were Protestant Christians. They did not have a Catholic Inquisition. They did not answer to the Pope. So they went about things differently. Now they still baptized their slaves. They of course stripped away the heritage that these Negroes had. So I wanted to make this just to put this claim to rest that these Ashkenazi Jews are descendants of King David or any of the biblical Jews. These Europeans are converts. They are not directly tied to the lineage of the Jews or Israelites at all. These are Eastern Europeans that were converted to Judaism, the religion. These are those who are described in Revelation chapter 2, verse 9 as the synagogue of, and John 8, verse 44 describes the nature of who they are. It says, "You are of your father, the devil, and the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and a father of it." So this person, the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, claiming that he and his family are direct descendants of King Solomon, he is a lie. So do not be deceived. Those who carry the lineage of King David are Negroes. They are the so-called Negroes of today. And they match up with the Afro-Iranians, those who settled on the southern coast of Iran and Iraq, those Afro-Iranians, Afro-Iraqis. They have the same DNA haplogroup of E1B1A. As Bible prophecy says, the real Jews and Israelites will be scattered to the four corners of the earth.